Good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with me tonight is Father John Whiteford. Father John, how are we doing tonight?
Doing good. Good to be back.
It's good to be back, and it's good to have you on this topic because it's such a crucially important topic. It has to do with gender roles. So often when we say gender roles, the first thing people think of is things women have to do. But last time I checked, there's two genders. And so that means these things that pertain to both men and women, and what's appropriate for the sanctification of both men and women, because ultimately we're concerned about the spiritual aspects and the teachings of the church on this. But I think this issue is immediately relevant due to the reality of the culture we live in, which is antithetical to the teaching, his traditional teaching of the church. And the antithetical secular values that pertain to gender at this stage in the game have begun infecting the church and all corners of Christendom throughout the world. And so I think maybe to begin this issue, maybe we'll talk more generally about egalitarian gender ideology. And then maybe after we said, all right, this is where we're working from, where society is right now, then we could start talking about what the church teaches, and the audience could compare and contrast the difference in values. So let me pose you this first. What is gender egalitarianism all about, Father?
Well, I suppose first maybe we ought to talk about egalitarianism, which is this idea. Well, let me mute my phone. I didn't realize I left my sound on here. Egalitarian is the idea that everybody is equal in the absolute sense of that phrase, and the problem is that's never been true, and it never will be true. There's a sense that we all are equal in the sense that God loves each and every one of us. We're all made in the image of God, so in that sense we're all equal. And in a just society, everyone would be equal before the law. The law would treat people equally. That's what the Old Testament law frequently talks about, how the judges are not to respect the person because they're rich or because they're poor. They're not to, they're not to side with a poor person just because they feel sorry for the poor person. They're not to side with a rich person because he's got a lot of money and he's powerful. They're to be just and equal and examine the case fairly. But every society and every group of human beings has a hierarchy to it. And there's a hierarchy that emerges, and the people who push egalitarianism, they're the ones that want to be in charge of that society. So they're using the rhetoric of egalitarianism just to put themselves in the position of the guy that gets to tell everybody else what to do. But you can't have a society where everybody is equal and there's no hierarchy. There's always going to be a hierarchy. Now, when it comes to gender issues, I suppose obviously you always have had women who maybe resent some of the aspects of how women were treated. And in some cases, they probably had good reason to resent it because there were men who didn't treat them well. But I think that in more recent times, at least, it's been used as a way of sort of driving a wedge in society. And that's not the only wedge. We've got people using race for the same reason. The communists tried to use class, and it worked successfully in some places. But in the United States, that didn't work because even poor people in the United States figured that they could be rich if they worked hard enough and they had plenty of opportunities. So they had to start using other issues to make wedges in society. But I think the goal ultimately of the people pushing this stuff is they want to break down the order that we have so they can usher in a new order. And the problem is the new order they're going to usher in is not going to be an improvement over the one that we have. I mean, when you have problems in society, what you want to do is you want to identify the areas that need to be fixed and fix them. You don't want to overthrow society. Just like if you have a house and you've got a roof leaking, you don't burn the house down to deal with the roof leak. You fix the leak. And if you've got termites in one part of your house, you might have to cut out some wood and put some new wood in there and get exterminator out there to take care of the termites, but you don't set the house on fire.
Wasn't that a song though, burning down the house?
Right. But that's what our modern progressive quote unquote folks that are pushing critical theory and its various manifestations are trying to accomplish. They want to burn the house down so that they can reorder society in a way that never has worked and never will work.
And so, being that and we discussed this quite a bit when we were talking about Marxism, I think about a year ago in one of the shows. And people aren't aware of this, but ideologues, really left-wing ideologues, communists specifically, were identifying these sort of wedge issues, as you were saying, in critical theory to figure out, well, how do we usher in communism, but not strictly because of economic disparity. And hence, as you were alluding to, mostly race, particularly in the history of the United States due to slavery and immigration, but also the issue of gender. But it would seem that with gender, you run into a difficulty, which is while a lot of differences between race, other than the superficial, have not really been borne out in science conclusively, where like other than things like sickle cell, Mongolians not getting scurvy, stuff like that, differences between gender are dramatic and empirically proven, and a 3-year-old could identify these things. So, for example, men are stronger than women. Men are more physically aggressive than women. Women could bear children. Men can't. Things to this effect. And so what kind of conflicts does egalitarianism run into against the genetic realities and difference between gender? And then that'd be my question. And just so that you're aware, where would be leading to then would be the traditional views and perhaps how they complemented these genetic realities.
Well, basically what the feminist types want to push and have been pushing is not, they're not arguing with people and trying to prove that there are differences between men and women. They're actually trying to argue that there really are no essential differences between men and women, that we just have different body parts. But other than that, we're really the same, and there's no reason why women should have any different roles in society than men. And it's a ridiculous position to hold, because as soon as you have women being put into roles that have traditionally been done by men, you then have to make all these accommodations because women are in fact different. And one thing that's interesting is if you look at, who are the guys picking up your trash, a couple times a week? Who are the guys that are cleaning out the sewers? You don't see women fighting for those jobs. I don't think I've ever seen a woman on a trash dump truck going around the neighborhood picking up my trash.
No, it's a good paying job. I think if people realize that, they want to do that. But continue.
Right, and there's lots of dangerous jobs that continue to be, and unpleasant jobs that continue to be essentially male only. But it's sort of the more flashy jobs that pay well and get more attention that women have wanted to take over. And I'm not saying that every job that had traditionally in the past been done by men couldn't be done by women, but the idea that there should be no distinctions, or that the fact that women make less money than men is supposedly proof that there's inherent discrimination, when as a matter of fact the reality is that men typically make less money than women in the same position. It's just that women take time off to have babies, and so that puts them at a disadvantage career-wise. But if you have a woman who's ready to forego having children and climb up the ladder, there's really no reason why she can't go up most of these ladders. But there are some jobs that women are just not suited for at all. And I would say, fighting in the infantry unit in Afghanistan would be one. I just saw a TikTok video. It looked like it was a Marine Corps drill instructor who was a woman who was trying to do the Sergeant Carter routine, with Gomer Pyle with a female recruit. And both of them were laughable because this woman's trying to come off like this screaming, burly man, and she wasn't able to pull it off, although she did a much better job of it than the recruit, who, when she was told to answer, "Yes, ma'am, ma'am, yes, ma'am," it was just such a, she's not a man. She doesn't have the muscles. And when you can see all kinds of videos of women who are training for combat where they're going through these kinds of exercises that men would typically go through, and their efforts are very feeble because they're just not physically as strong as men. They're not up to it. We don't want women fighting physical battles. It's never been, it's never been for a reason. I mean, there have always been some exceptions, I suppose, you could point to in the history of the human race, but that's just not been the norm. And the other thing of it is that the Israelis actually discovered that mixing men with women was a bad idea in combat, because men will do crazy things if there's a woman in danger that they would not do for another man.
Men do crazy things for women, period.
Right. But the thing is, when you're trying to run a military operation, you don't want men doing crazy things to save one woman in distress when you need to focus on the goal of the mission. And so if a man sees one of his buddies getting shot and he's wounded, he's going to do what he can for his buddy, but he's not going to jeopardize the mission. But men will do crazy things that do jeopardize the mission when there's a woman involved, and it's part of our nature. Men are protectors, and men especially feel an obligation to protect women. And this is just something that you can try to reprogram people, but you will never be successful, because Mother Nature is going to kick your butt every time. It's just the way that it is. And there are empirical studies that back these things up. Men are just different than women, and women are different than men, and they both have strengths and they both have weaknesses. And when they're used in their proper way, they're complementary. But when you try to make a man do a woman's job, you're going to have a very poor job done. And when you try to make a woman do a man's job, the same is also true.
I have several comments which I think are relevant to this. And chief among them would be that it's not a matter of opinion. We're two grouchy guys complaining or something. Just look at any fire department. What is physically demanded for a woman is different than a man. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Of course, there's women out there stronger than me, like bodybuilders and stuff like that. But that would be the exception, not the rule. And Every institution which has women doing physical work, in which they have to put preferential hiring standards in, for example, we're going to a religion, by the way, guys. We're just trying to get there.
Right.
Preferential hiring standards will make the demands for women less, because it's just a physical reality. There's no denying it. And a large part of this, we've been trying to deny this reality, has been through, for example, surgeries or hormone replacement, all because we're trying to artificially undo what is demanded by the difference in actual chromosomes, which this is genetically encoded. There's no doubt about this. So the segue closer to the realm of religion, the issue is societies have traditionally had patriarchal societies, and all ideal patriarchal societies, because we're a world fallen in sin, and so all have fallen short from the grace of God, obviously, that in traditional patriarchal societies, men protect women. So, for example, we watch the movie Titanic, and they say women and children first. We don't view it that quaint. We know that a civilized society protects its most vulnerable. A society that takes vulnerable people and allows them to die in the streets is not very civilized. But a society that protects its vulnerable people, for example, doesn't take its women and throw them into war, doesn't take their children and turn them into soldiers, that allows them to take life rafts before the men. That is a society that is civilized and should be extolled. That's not a matter of prejudice between men and women. This is a matter of civility, which has been greatly lost. And so oftentimes this gets reduced to make my sandwich, but this is actually men being called to be more like Christ and to be sacrificial and to be civilized and protect vulnerable people. And so that gets forgotten a lot in this discussion. So that being the case, because societies worldwide historically have either intentionally for Christian societies or unintentionally have been mimicking these Christological realities, right, of protecting the vulnerable, serving. That's what those in authority do. I want to now talk about how this looks like in the church. And so let's start before we talk about maybe home. Let's talk about the church. How has the church historically had these differences? Like we said, there's differences on the Titanic. Well, how about the church? How has the church historically had differences in gender roles?
Well, just sort of as a generalization, men have tended to be the ones that took leadership roles in the church, and women took supporting roles. And a lot of people would then say, oh, well, that's terrible. Why can't women lead? Well, you know what? When I was a kid growing up Protestant, I don't remember hardly any adult men coming to church. It was all women and children, young men, that were not old enough to say, I don't want to go to church. There, obviously there was the pastor. There were some exceptions to this. But when women take leadership roles in the church, men tend to stand back and let them do it and not do anything. And I can tell you from observation, I've seen how women will wind up doing everything in the church if you don't push men forward to start taking a leadership position, because men naturally have a desire to do that. But men also have negative inclinations too. And if you don't direct men to do positive things that build up your community, men will then do negative things that will tear down your community. Men make great fathers and they make great providers, but if you kick them out of those roles and basically make them into sperm donors and ATM machines, they're not going to be very productive. They're going to start engaging in negative behaviors. And
you're alluding to self-destructive behaviors like the heroin epidemic we have now in this country.
And also crime, violence. There's all kinds of things that men will do when they're not being when their natural energies are not being directed in a positive way. And it's women who historically have been the ones who have directed men to do in these positive ways. This is the thing, people tend to think of men being leaders as, oh, well, that's men just telling everybody else what to do. It's always been the case that women were the ones pushing men to take those positions because men were good at it and they needed women to push them into it. And so basically women have always been really the basic organizing people behind society. And they've directed men to behave in ways that build that society up. But men, there's things that they can do well, and then there's lots of things that they will do very badly if they're not directed to do things well.
And so being that God knows how he made the genders, and we as Orthodox Christians believe that the Holy Spirit guides our church and preserves the church from error, then what you're expounding is that the church has traditionally reinforced this because this is what's necessary for the sanctification of all its people. Would you agree with that?
Right, and this is how human nature was designed. And the thing of it is, it's not even really debatable if you look at empirical evidence. There was a study that was done in Switzerland several years ago where they were looking at what kind of households produce children who grow up and keep going to church. And so they looked at families where both parents were churchgoers, families where the mother was a churchgoer but the father was not, and families where the father was a churchgoer but the mother was not. And so which one of these situations wound up with children that went to church? And families where the mother was going to church were the least likely, but the father was not going to church, were the least likely to have children that actually grew up and stayed in church. Now, we all know that women have historically been the ones that provide the primary religious instruction for children. It's just been part of raising children. And they're the ones that had the most hands-on aspect to it. But the fathers had a role too, and they had a leadership role. And when you have fathers that take that leadership role spiritually, children recognize it. But when you have the fathers that are going in a different direction, then even though the mother may have all the best intentions and be the most pious woman in the world, it's a lot less likely to be successful. Now, when you have both parents that are churchgoers, they obviously did better than the families where the mother was the churchgoer and the father was not. But interestingly, the families that had the highest retention rate in the church were families where the father was a churchgoer and the mother was not. And here's my explanation for this. The study didn't say this, but I think this is the only thing that makes sense. And I think that's because a lot of times when the father is a churchgoer and the mother is a churchgoer, the father is only going because he's trying to make his wife happy, but he's not really got his heart in it. Whereas a father who's going to church even when his wife is not going to church would be a father who's going to church because he feels like it really is important to him. And what all this proves, beyond the shadow of any doubt, is that people naturally look to their fathers for leadership. And when their fathers lead them in a positive way, they're more likely to respond to it. And when their fathers fail to lead or lead them in a negative direction, then bad results happen from that.
Now, being that this is the case, and we're talking about teaching in the church historically, women have taught children. We will talk about in a little bit how they've taught outsiders. Apollos was initiated by Prisca and Aquila. But those matters aside, how about the issue of deaconesses? Because they're in the canons. You could read the canons of Trullo. They're there. And we know that there's some sort of kind of fake deaconesses in the Patriarchate of Alexandria that are reinitiated in Africa because there's no real ordination. There's all sorts of weird hubbub around it. But how about, could you give us at least some background in what the role of deaconesses was and maybe tell us, do they fit in today? What's the issue around that?
Well, deaconesses in the early church, and it actually was never an office that existed throughout the church, but it obviously was a big enough of an office to where the canons did talk about them. But they were unmarried women. They were women who were, above childbearing years for that time. I mean, obviously, women can bear children longer if they live in a society like ours, where you have lots of abundant nutrition and that sort of stuff, and good health care. But in those days, typically women stopped bearing children after the age of 40, and or at least was often the case. And so they usually were nuns, often the abbess of a monastery. And if you look at how they actually functioned, they functioned in performing the actual baptisms of adult women converts, because in the early church, every adult and child was baptized in the nude. And so obviously you wouldn't want to have priests baptizing adult women in the nude and being the one that actually sees all this happening and does all the stuff, does all the anointings and that kind of stuff. It would be very unseemly and a bad thing for all concerned. So the deaconesses would be the ones that would be doing all this, and the priest would be behind a screen, unable to see anything that was going on, but just simply pronouncing the words for the sacrament. And also in Constantinople and the Hagia Sophia, deaconesses had a choir. They were in charge of making sure that the women were behaving themselves in the part of the church where the women were. And in the Holy Sepulchre, I think they functioned in a very similar way. So we have texts that talk about what they did, but what they did not do is they were not just female deacons functioning the same way male deacons did. They didn't go out there and do litanies. There were some similarities. They were ordained in the altar. They communed in the altar. So in that respect, it would be similar to a male deacon, but otherwise didn't serve the same way. Their liturgical functions were very limited. And the people who are advocating for the female diaconate now are typically wanting to say women should just function like male deacons and just women. And the ones that are honest will readily acknowledge that this is not the way deaconesses actually were, and historically they're trying to do something different now. But they don't usually talk when they're pushing the propaganda. They just simply say, well, yeah, there were deaconesses in the ancient church, so it should be deaconesses now. They don't as frequently acknowledge that they're talking about implementing something that's totally different than what existed in the early church. And the office of deaconess essentially ceased to function and ceased to exist because once you had countries where everybody who was likely to become a Christian had already become a Christian and their children were being raised in the church from infancy, you didn't have adult converts in very large numbers, and so there was no need to continue on with that practice. And of course, now when we have an adult woman convert or adult male convert for that matter, we don't baptize them in the nude because practicalities have dictated otherwise. So we just don't do it that way. So the need for a deaconess is just not there.
Well, and also, as you were alluding to, and you could read this in St. Hippolytus and other early sources, St. Paul even mentions it. The deaconesses and the old women on the widows list, they were paid to pray. They were essentially nuns. They just didn't call them that. Right. And so when you had institutional monasticism as compared to in the earliest of church, you just had people that were ascetic, and really the first institutional monastics would have been the deaconesses. But once you just have monasticism as a large societal institution in of itself, it sort of renders the office of deaconess really not useful anymore. You had nuns running hospitals and houses for the poor and doing things deaconesses would have done. And so once you remove the liturgical function for baptism, it just falls into disuse. Why do we have this? And so I think you point out rightly that the real danger in the reinstitution of the office wouldn't be the right word, but the role of deaconess is that it's seen as a backdoor ultimately to women priests to overturn the whole correct gender stratified order within the church, which we'll talk about. What people aren't calling for is, well, we want to go back to the correct original form of baptism. Well, then we should have that conversation if that's the goal, because we have vocational monastics that are women that pray for the church. And so we don't need the role of deaconess specifically for that matter issue when that did exist in the past. So it's something I'm personally open to for liturgical, the sake of being liturgically conservative, but we have to be honest with ourselves with this is not the motivation of the people pushing it. And so we cannot give to people something they don't want. They don't want a conservative liturgical custom. They actually want to overturn that. And so that'd be a step in the wrong direction. And so, and someone says, pay for pray. You bet. That's why we help out the monasteries. And so anyway, I do want to say this because actually you made a comment about a little while before that reminded me of how you said, well, without men taking leadership positions in the church is wither and die. We see it all the time. The churches that are dying and losing members, there's no older men. The churches that are growing, you see nuclear families, you see older men there taking lead. It's anyone that would ignore this would be ignoring a basic sociological reality. But what's the spiritual reality behind this? And I want to quote a homily from new martyr Daniel Syzoyev. And so it's in his book of homilies, page 49, for those who want to look into it. He says, whoever wants to be on top is cured by being on the bottom. In other words, at a lower level. The wife wanted to be over her husband, so she's made to submit to him. It is a basic principle. When a branch is bending the wrong way, they bend it back in the opposite direction. And so what Martyr Daniel Syzoyev was perceiving was that when men lose these certain positions of authority and they don't have a positive way to direct energies in leadership, then they very easily capitulate and they become irrelevant. While women, even in the most horribly patriarchal societies, being ran in ways which are demean the women, have always found out ways in which to get their word in edgewise and to influence things. So, for example, Pakistan and Iran have had female leaders. And so this has always occurred. And this seems to come more naturally to women than men, even though that is counterintuitive. And so God has corrected this by trying to make what people struggle with something that is corrected with a discipline that is directed towards that. And so that's directed towards creation within gender roles, but also what the church expounds that what men and women should be doing, not only at church, but in marriage, in their families. So let's, right before we get to maybe marital roles and how that pertains to gender, let me just ask this more generally. Teaching in the church, should a woman in your view be able to do catechesis, or is that a violation of 1 Timothy chapter 2? Should she be able to teach in seminary? Should she be able to, after the gospel's read, teach in front of the church? How do we apply the teaching in 1 Timothy chapter 2?
Well, I think that women should not be preaching in church. I think that would definitely be a violation of what St. Paul had to say. But when you're talking about catechesis, I think if you have a woman who's able to do it, and there's a need, I think that that's a role they certainly could fill. It would probably be better when you're dealing with adult men to have a man who is able to do it. But I think if you don't have somebody who's able to step up to the plate and do that, and you had a woman who was, that you would probably say that would be better than nothing. But and it's not that it's not the authority issue as much as it gets back to trying to get men to step up to the plate and how you go about doing it. And if you allow women to take over all these kinds of functions at every level of the church, you then have men who just stand back and let them do it and twiddle their thumbs, or just don't come to church. And these are just realities. You want to encourage men to step into these roles. So it just depends on the circumstances, but I think there definitely is a line when you're talking about the service of the church that it's not been appropriate in the past, and there's no reason why we should say that it ought to be appropriate now.
Now, I think one thing that people don't take into account is we always speak of what's normative and what's exceptional. There's been saints that have been queens that have ran countries, have ordered all sorts of people around. We have saints that have evangelized, like Saint Nino. We have saints that have taught men. But also, we have to be aware of the context of these things. Being a queen in many respects wasn't democracy, was involuntary. You were born royalty. You were married into it. Your husband died. Now you're the queen and you're running the country. These are not things that were exactly women were striving to do specifically, but what they actually had to do to fulfill their function in their family due to the class they were born in and what that society demanded from that class. But being that caste is something so far away from the American experience, I want to also talk about the fact that with teaching, the real issue is, St. Paul says, it's not a matter of culture. Oh, He-Man Women Haters Club was what St. Paul was part of when he was a kid, and that rubbed off on him. No. He sources this in creation. He says the reason we don't do this, and he mentions this also in the letter to Corinthians, is that a woman was deceived, not Adam. That is the reason. And so he's saying in the church, the problem with women teaching the men is that this will lead to massive theological problems. So it occurred, obviously, in the Garden of Eden, and only someone who is completely not paying attention would realize everywhere in which female teaching has taken hold within the church on any level, meaning seminaries, for example, things that are considered of a quasi-secular church function, on any level has led to liberalism and the loss of traditional doctrine, precisely what St. Paul was talking about. It's amazing how perceptive you could be when you have the grace of the Holy Spirit. And so normatively, women should not be having roles in any of these things other than children or in private, because none of this is not about private conversation. St. John Chrysostom speaks about that's how Apollos was converted by Priscilla and Aquila, and he points out, and Priscilla taught in private. And he also points out that women should teach in every way, but at home and their children. And so there are legitimate contexts, and it's not because women are incapable of teaching. In fact, much the opposite. They're more than intellectually capable. They're too capable of doing it, because despite the fact that creation teaches and that they should not, that they will find themselves in the role, and exceptions do occur, and women have done incredible things in the church. And the saints of the desert fathers, they're saints of desert mothers. So we do heed teachings that is, of female saints. But for anyone to say that this is normative because we have these exceptional women throughout the history of Christianity would be a liar. And so that's something we should point out. And I feel that the perception of authority is not only dangerous to men, as you say, they disengage, it's dangerous spiritually for women. We read that from the Martyr Daniel Caesarea. If you're taking away what's meant to correct a spiritual issue, where we all want meekness, and this is a way for women to grow in meekness. So we don't want to take away from something that helps someone be sanctified. It's not about elevating the man. It's actually about spiritually elevating the woman as well. And that so often gets forgotten when we imbibe in these worldly values where sanctification is not the goal. And so to sum up my comments, it would be normatively, we want men in these roles other than, who's teaching the kids to color in with crayons the picture of Jesus during church school. That doesn't obviously need to be a man. That would be totally appropriate for a woman. But let me ask this, and I'm going to start with child rearing, because that kind of segues into this. What's a woman's role in child rearing, being that 1 Timothy 2 and Titus chapter 2 are so emphatic about a woman's role in this? So what do the scriptures and the saints teach about the woman's role in the home, particularly with the children and running the household?
Well, it's very clear that women are naturally equipped to raise children. I once took a class from a very liberal seminary and a very liberal professor, and he was somehow complaining about the fact that the Israelites didn't have women in leadership roles. And I pointed out to him that leadership roles in ancient times generally were the result of people who were warriors who emerged, up through the people noted, here's a brave, strong man who can lead us. So that's why they would start following that person. And this guy actually made the statement, they could have had women who were warriors. They had goats. They could have milked those goats and fed the babies. Because I was pointing out to him, obviously, women breastfeed children. If they're having children, you can't have the man stay home and breastfeed the child. You have to have the woman do that. Well, they had goats. They could milk the goats, but they didn't have latex nipples back then. So the idea that the Israelites should have had women out there fighting their battles while men stayed home and nursed babies with goat's milk is just so insane. And besides that, particularly when you're talking about ancient warfare, it was all about physical strength. And as you said, there's the occasional woman who could whoop a man, the average man, that would maybe be able to actually pull it off, but they're exceptional. For the most part, women are not up to the job, and men are more likely to be up to the job. And so that's the reason why these things are that way, and God made it that way. And so rather than trying to fight against God's creation, or Mother Nature, to use a colloquial expression, but it's really, we're talking about God's created order, we ought to try to find ways to go along with it. Because the thing is, we want to think that the man's role is the good role and what women do is somehow not important. Well, if you think about that from a feminist perspective, they ought to be saying just the opposite. They ought to be trying to build up the role that women actually fulfill and talking about how important it is, because it really is.
It's the most important role.
I don't know if you still have both of your parents, but I've lost both of my parents, and I think that if you talk to anybody who's lost both their parents, you ask them which one was the hardest loss. Probably about 95% of the answers you're going to get are, oh, it was much harder to lose your mother, because there's nobody like your mother. I mean, the relationship you have with your mother is special. It's unique. The relationship you have with your father is different, but it's also crucial. And the fact that we have so many people being raised without that is why society is in such a screwed up state right now. So, if you want to find out what a part does in a car and you take it out and you see how it doesn't work, that we should have learned at least that much. So you take the man out of the home, you start having all these bad results in terms of child rearing as a result of that. But women's role are very special, and your relationship with your mother is like no other. Why would we not want to see that as a huge position? To be that person to one or more children, usually more. If we're talking about a historic society, what a blessing that is. But we want to downplay that and say, well, no, she shouldn't be raising children. She should be wielding the sword in battle, while the husband stays home and nurses the babies with goat's milk. That's just insane. And you think about it in terms of the Christian faith, who aside from the Lord himself, who has the advantage of being 100% God in addition to being 100% man, but if we remove him from the equation just for a moment and ask, who's the greatest person in the history of the church, we would say the Virgin Mary is the greatest person. But what did the Virgin Mary ever do? She didn't fight any battle. She didn't become a politician. She didn't go out and teach people. She was just the mother of the Lord. And she was just
a mother.
Movement. And she wound up being the mother of the church. And so we don't say she's somehow less of a person as a result of that. We say she's more honorable than the cherubim and Bianca per more glorious than the seraphim. There's nobody that's on the same level as the Virgin Mary in the history of the human race. If we're not talking about the one that was the God man, her child.
Yes, that's why it's destructive for the church not to extol women to follow the path of the Theotokos, for how that sanctifies them.
Right.
Because the Theotokos was saved through childbearing, right? The fathers are emphatic about this at the Annunciation and her purification and spiritual height she attained to increasingly after that point as well. And so,
and also, if the Lord was gonna ordain a woman apostle, who would have been the most likely candidate on the list of possible candidates? It would have been the mother of God.
Yeah.
But she wasn't. She was not ordained to any office. And so that doesn't make her less in the church. She's actually more.
And women took part, just like missionaries today are often husband-wife teams. Women took part in missionary work, but oftentimes they often offering material assistance, which we see in the Gospel of Luke. We see in the traditions revolving around the Theotokos that she assisted St. John in Ephesus. And so women do take a role, and they complement men because we're stronger. There's an expression, too many chiefs and the more bosses, not always the better. We need people doing all different things. And the scripture,
too many chiefs and not enough Indians is the expression you were trying to remember.
Too many chiefs. Okay, so there you go. So that's precisely the problem. The scriptures speak about that. The eye can't say to the hands, "I have no need for you," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. All the organs have a role within the church. We all fulfill a function, right. And we even see among the greatest saints and women that are leaders, whether they be empresses, whether they be Deborah, whether they be Esther. They fill functions, exceptional functions, but they're not necessarily banging their chests and throwing spears into people's hearts. We have saints that have done that as well. And so they've, and sometimes led, but in ways in which are also different, keeping with the roles of gender, which sanctify the individuals involved, which is what we're concerned about. So Orthodoxy, for the uninitiated, is a faith that is essentially a quasi-monasticism for the laity, working up this way to full-blown monasticism in a sense. We all believe that everyone should be doing ascetic disciplines. That's why we have a liturgical calendar with fast and all that fun stuff. And so gender roles are just a form of obediences. And without obedience, no one is saved. And so it should be no surprise to the Orthodox that Satan's trying to introduce disobedience to the church. St. Paisios purposely took on, when he was too far away from his spiritual father, obediences from a 12-year-old, because he said, I'd rather have an obedience from a 12-year-old than none at all. That's a very loose paraphrase, but the point is, he really did do that. And so under no circumstance do we want to remove obediences, because they're necessary for both genders' salvation. And so that's something that is not said enough. Now, being that we spoke about the role at home, how about marital roles? Let me admit something about me when I was 21 years old and read the Bible first time. And it said something about women submit to men. And it didn't surprise me, because I know this is an old thing and people were like that back then. But it sounds good. It doesn't sound to me so good anymore as an older man. But women submitting to me? That sounds like I would want my wife to do that. That sounds great. And so too often people see what the scriptures say about leadership and submission as something that is a woman being a floor mat and something just a great perk for the man. Now, being that both of us are married men, we've read the saints of scripture, so we know that's not the case. Let me ask you this. What is your understanding of marital roles?
Well, one of the things that St. John Chrysostom talks about when he comments on the passages that refer to the wives' need to submit to their husbands is he compares it with the relationship between the son and the father. And he says the father and the son are equal, but the son submits to the father. And so the husband and the wife are equal in that they're both created in the image of God, but the wife submits to the husband if she's doing what the scriptures tell her to do, because that's the role that she has in that relationship. That doesn't mean that the husband's always right or that she never gives an opinion or anything like that. I don't think it's ever been, at least very frequently, the case that the husband just dictated how things are going to be and the wives never had anything to say about it. One of the things about men that women need to know, if they haven't already figured it out, and of course some of them have, is that men spend all of their lives trying to please the women in their lives. They want the affirmation that they get from those women. And so you start off when you're a boy, you want to please your mom. And Bill Cosby years ago, he had a comedy routine where he's talking about being a father and talking about how, the father plays with his kid, teaches him how to play football, baseball, takes him out to the games, all that kind of stuff. And then you see these guys that wind up in the NFL and it's the Super Bowl and the camera pans over to their son. And what does the NFL player say? Hi, Mom. He doesn't say hi, Dad. He says hi, Mom, because he wants the approval of his mother. And when you get married, you want the approval of your wife. And obviously, if you're treating your wife like a gal,
that deep down,
you're not going to get the approval of your wife,
because that's how they get you.
So men have always cared what their women thought, and they've always tried to please them. But men have they're created by God to be in leadership roles, and they actually need women to support them and to encourage them to take that role, because otherwise they won't. I mean, if you take the example of the prophetess Hannah, that was called upon. Am I remembering the name of the prophetess right? But she was the one that Barak
Deborah, right?
was the general. If I'm remembering the wrong name, it took a momentary brain fog. But anyway, she was a judge, so she had a leadership role. She was a prophetess. People came to her and asked her to decide matters because she was a woman who had spiritual insight. And there was a need for the Israelites to go to war with these Canaanites. And she tried to get Barak to do it. And he basically said, I'm not going to do it if you're not going to go with me. And so she chided him for not doing it. I mean, he actually wound up doing what he was supposed to do, but he needed her to be there with him because he was afraid that without her guidance, he would fail. And so he said that a woman's going to wind up getting the honor of this battle, and a woman wound up killing the pagan king by nailing a tent peg through his temples while he was asleep. So two women wound up shining in that story, and one man kind of came off not so good. But men need women to encourage the women in their lives to encourage them to take these roles, and that's where they're best. And when it comes to the church, we have fatherly roles in the church and we have motherly roles in the church. And so, for example, in a typical parish, you've got a priest who has a fatherly role. You've got a matушka, and you've got other women in the parish who have motherly roles in the parish. If you try to reverse those things, it's not going to end well. Women don't make good fathers, and men don't make good mothers. You're trying to go against Mother Nature, and it just ain't going to work.
And I think when we look at what the scriptures teach, and they speak of the wife submitting to the husband as the church submits to Christ, and these sort of scandalous passages, but they're not scandalous if you care about people's salvation, because these are Christological realities, as you began your answer with. And
by the
these
way, I just remembered,
realities,
it's a prophetess Deborah. I knew that didn't sound right. Prophetess Deborah. Okay, so the brain fog is over. All right, go ahead.
Hannah's a holy woman. She was mother of Samuel. So that being said, we have the importance of these Christological relationships. And the woman could sometimes be in the place of Christ and others in the place of church, like when she's the parent, because children submit to parents, or when she's it's used the term slavery, or when she's the boss, just like the slave looks at her mistress, is one the Psalms talks about. Well, the slaves have to obey the slave master, but the slave masters ought to be good to their slaves, or the bosses ought to be good to their employees. We're going to update the language in the paradigm. The children, the parents should not exasperate their children. The husband, it says in 1 Peter 3:7, should honor his wife. So these are not one-way streets. It's both people being obedient in different ways in such a sense, which is to the maximum degree edifying the sanctification of each party given the relationship.
And the husband is not just to honor the wife, but he's supposed to lay down his life for his wife. And the thing of it is, I think if you ask most women, if you had a husband that was just like Jesus Christ and loved you and was willing to sacrifice himself for you, would you be okay with submitting to a husband like that? I think most of them would say, sure. So that's what men need to do, is not try to demand submission, but to try to inspire the wife to follow his leadership by being like Christ. And so you should never get out those verses and try to tell your wife, look, it says you're supposed to submit, so you need to do what I tell you to do. That's not the way those verses are supposed to be used. You pray that your wife comes along if you feel like she needs to on those issues, but you inspire her to come along by being a Christ-like husband.
Well, it's like in 1 Peter 3, verses 1-6 are about how a wife ought to be with her husband, winning her husband over without words, with meekness, the things for her salvation. But people forget verse 7 starts with, in the same way, husbands, honor your wives. So there's a sort of submission the husband has, because we submit our own interests for the sake of our wives. Right. We lay down our lives, maybe not jump in front of a train to save our life or something traumatic, but all sorts of, we could sacrifice things in our careers, our physical health. Men tendally are the ones that smash the spiders or do the things with chemicals and all sorts of stuff. Men die before women, and that's probably a large part of the reason why, actually, is the more dangerous behavior. But that doesn't always happen in a blaze of glory. And so in the same way, men ought to be doing these things, but in the sense that is to the maximum sanctification for each person, which is different, like New Modern Daniel Sazoyev says.
Right.
God puts different nuances because each person is built a little differently. And this helps sanctify both person, because obedience always, we're being obedient to a command from God ultimately, both of us, men and women.
You know, I just saw a video yesterday, and I don't know where this video was taken, but there was some woman who was an alligator trainer. And she was showing, you know, there were people who came to watch her do whatever she was doing with this alligator, but the alligator wound up grabbing a hold of her with his teeth and pulled her into the tank and was about to drown her. And some man who was not probably even related or even knew who this woman was jumped into the tank, wrestled the alligator, and freed this woman from the alligator, and then continued to hold the alligator. And then the woman, who's a trainer, mind you, told him what to do to be able to get out of the tank himself. So she had the knowledge of what needed to be done, but she didn't have the physical strength. But that's men doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's a natural power, energy that men have. They want to protect women. And back when we had all this flooding in Houston, you probably remember there's a famous picture that was taken of some firefighter who was carrying a woman who was also carrying a little baby to safety. And people, you know, put out lots of memes like saying toxic masculinity at work, you know, or something like that. But that's masculinity doing what it's supposed to be doing, protecting women who are nurturers. Who that mother was protecting her child. This man, who was probably no relation to her, was protecting her just simply because she was a woman and she needed it.
Well, let's blow up the leftists by just reiterating, which is civility is exhibited by a society that protects its most vulnerable. And that's precisely what that is an example of. And I like to word it in that sense because it's very hard for them to disagree with. Society should not protect the vulnerable. Wait, I thought that's what you were teaching us all along. So that aside, let's talk about the issue of women working, because some people could get a hyper focus on, it says women being keeper of the homes, but we have saints that have vocations. And so is being a keeper home just equal to having a job, or what does women and work have to do with being a Christian?
Well, in Proverbs 30, I believe it's the chapter that talks about sort of the ideal woman. It talks about how she rises early. She basically prepares everything for the family. She orders the servants of the house and you know gets them about doing what they need to be doing, and she does all kinds of industrious things that turns profit for the family, and she brings honor to her husband. So you can't think of ancient times or more traditional cultures in terms of sort of 1950s housewives that were staying at home and watching soap operas and, you know, cleaning the house and that kind of stuff. Not to say that those women were not doing anything, mind you. I'm just saying that it's historically been the case that women who stayed home also did all kinds of things to produce things of value for the family to put food on the table. And so the idea that women shouldn't be doing anything other than just taking care of their children is not something that you can really defend, nor do I think we would really want that. I mean, we want women to put their talents to use, but in terms of what their priorities should be, it should be making sure that they're taking care of their children and then later on their grandchildren. That's the way the priorities ought to be. And, you know, obviously men have different priorities, but I can tell you as a person who's now retired from the state of Texas and has a granddaughter that occupies quite a bit of my time, I've been a lot less productive than I would have liked to have been in the last 2 years. But I'm enjoying the heck out of taking care of my granddaughter quite a bit of the time. So, I mean, I think that these things are great blessings. I don't think that there's any reason why any woman wouldn't want that. But the thing is that society has tried to brainwash women into thinking that none of that's of any value. Taking care of your children, raising your children, that's nothing. You don't have any worth in society unless you have a career, unless you've got multiple degrees, you're some kind of a professional. And this is not how a Christian woman ought to be looking at it. Now, obviously, if you're a single woman and you've got special talents and you pursue them for whatever reason, there's nothing that says that you can't do that. But if you choose to get married and you have children, that should be your number one priority. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of women in our society figure this out too late, because they wind up putting off having children until they have all these things that they've been brainwashed into thinking that they have to have value. But then that maternal instinct starts to really gnaw at them, and they want to have children. But you know what? When you're in your 40s and you want to start having children, your chances of being able to have a child are a lot less than they would have been back when you were 20. And Mother Nature says you should be having children in your 20s, maybe in your 30s, and then going from there. Because for one thing I can tell you is that women who are in their 30s and 40s who have babies have a hard time putting out the energy that's necessary to take care of small children. All these things, it's amazing how God designed all these things to work perfectly. That we have all this energy when we're young to do the things that young people need to do, and then as we get older, this energy starts to dissipate. If you just do what God has laid out for us, as we see clearly in nature, these things all seem to work pretty well. But there's lots of women who are in their 40s that are paying all kinds of doctors so that they can find some way to have a child, or else they're trying to adopt some child from Honduras or something like that and spending all kinds of money on that because they didn't have children when Mother Nature said they should have had children. And it results in their ultimate unhappiness. There's nothing, when you're on your deathbed, there's nothing about your career that's going to be more important than the human relationships that you had. And the most important relationships you have involve the children you produce, and then the grandchildren that you produce, that kind of stuff. Those are the things that really are going to matter the most to you when you're dying on your deathbed.
Now, I'm going to ask the audience, because they have something common with you and I, which is this. Someone gave birth to them. Someone took care of them. They got here somehow.
Right.
Now, you could have had a lousy upbringing, could have had a great upbringing. Is any career do you prefer that your parents' career is more important to them, or you are more important to them? Of course, you, right? Because we all love ourselves, right? But in this case, the issue is very clear. The priority obviously is to be a keeper of the home. And this is precisely what the scriptures extol women for. Younger women, Titus 2:4, ought to be taught to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. And so this is what the saints teach, that these are the things we should be extolling. But there are also spiritual gifts. New Martyr Daniel Sazoyev says, for example, that for a woman to not have a job and just be completely dedicated to being at home and rearing children is an immense spiritual gift. Not every woman's cut out for that, nor is it as common as some people think, even historically. The sort of Leave It to Beaver generation, where, which wasn't even that big in America, it's just you see it in the old TV. The man has a upper middle class job, and they all have a little perfect piece of suburban heaven, and he could afford to have the wife at home and just be a domestic. That is generally not as common, even in traditional societies. A Matushka, who's Bulgarian, not a Popadia, because she married an American who was in the OCA. So she's a Bulgarian Matushka, which is a little strange, just because it's not common. Spoke about how in Bulgaria, the mother and father work, and the grandparents, because they're older, will generally do the extra thing during work hours, looking after the kids, because it's a way of taking care of the elderly who can no longer go out there and work and make as much money, and it keeps the family together. And so these things exist in traditional societies, particularly in agrarian societies. The woman would be working. She wasn't watching TV. TV did not exist. She would have been like the woman in Proverbs 31, spinning wool, talking to servants about what to do, perhaps buying lands adjacent to her lands, buying and selling, working the garden, for example. You got to eat somehow. You got to make the clothing. So a lot of these things were industrious, but if you notice, they all also have a certain circumference around the home. There's a certain revolving around the family because people had to be pragmatic, right? There was no social security check coming in the mail. They had to take care of themselves. And so these roles held together these societies. And so women could be industrious and work, but that didn't necessarily exclude them in these relationships from also doing the things that St. Paul was extolling older women teach young women to do, that we just read in Titus chapter 2. And so I think that gets forgotten, and people want to either see Leave It to Beaver, or they want to see women could just work in the same way that men work and disregard familial relationships, and both aren't true. Well, we're always trying to apply, given life circumstances, what is to our spiritual benefit. And sometimes, and you work with your spiritual father with this, your person be working with you, father, you would be working towards, all right, well, we need this second income, or dad is injured in a workplace accident and he can't do this. And then you figure those things out with the spiritual father. What we're talking today is general things that the church has always taught, not how they're applied in certain circumstances. The last canon in Trullo is that the spiritual father, like a doctor administering medicine, could give and take medicine according to degree, according to what he needs. So we already know this. So let me ask you this, because people will take this stuff on, we don't have to do things black and white like it says in scriptures as life circumstances. What happens if we take this to the logical extreme? When our view of the scriptures is that we ought to always interpret them in this non-literal way, right? It's not St. Paul said this, but it doesn't apply today anymore. Or because there's exceptions, we don't really have to do this. What's that devolve into, Father?
Well, I mean, when you start dismissing what the scriptures are clearly teaching, you wind up suffering the consequences of going against God's order, because it's not like God tells us to do stuff just for arbitrary reasons. He tells us to do things because they're actually for our benefit. And so when you blow off what the scriptures are telling you, you're going to pay the consequences. When you talk about women and the need for a second income in the family, there were actually studies, and I've seen TV shows where people would, examine the family's income. A woman was working, but then they would analyze how much money is she spending on babysitter? How much money is she spending on the extra clothes that she needs to be dressed professionally at her job? How much money is she spending to get to and from work? And when you added up all the expenses, when you added all the expenses, they actually were paying money so that she would work outside of the home. And they would be far better off if they simply cut out those unnecessary expenses and had her staying home. And in some cases, they would have the mom say, well, I don't care. I like work. Well, okay. I can understand not wanting to be in the house with small children all day. I mean, I could see why that might be some women who desire to not be in that all the time by themselves. But it's not economic need that's pushing that. Now, obviously, there are some women who maybe they're such, their income capacity is so great that they're able to prove, I could spend all this money, but I'm still making a huge amount of money. And there might be the rare exception where, at least for some period of time, it would make sense even for a woman like that to have other people raising her children. But it's not. It's like you said, it's the exception. And one other thing, just sort of as an aside that you alluded to, that I think is an important point to make. This is another aspect of the dysfunctionality of our contemporary society. But we've been encouraged to just not care about staying near our family, but we go where the job is. And so even though your family is all in one area, you have a job opportunity in Timbuktu, Alaska. So you go and take that. Well, if you put yourself in that situation and your wife is having children, that means she has no family support outside of the home. And so I can understand why a woman like that would be very flustered, not having any outside help and having to take care of the kids all by herself. If we would just try as much as possible to stay near our families, so that we can draw on our extended family to help with these things, it would be beneficial on so many levels. And even if you think about, you might say, well, if that was true, no one would have ever settled the United States because they would all stayed where they were. Well, if you look at how people settled the United States, they moved in family groups. Entire extended families would move to a new part of the United States to settle it. They didn't go by, they didn't just have the husband and the wife moving out with their kids and making it go on their own. Their cousins would be going with them. Their grandparents would be going with them. Their aunts and their uncles. A whole group of family would go together because they knew they needed each other. And we maybe have less of a need, or we perceive it less, but we still have a need for family.
No, it's interesting because I think the main pressure to break up the family and make men and women work is not the actual economic demands of the average family. As you pointed out, and, I've actually cracked numbers, for my wife's, my own situation. Paying for help is more money. People don't realize this. A lot of people that do, generally one will quit a job. And so generally it costs them more money. So that's not the reality. But people have been told the lie that you can't be fulfilled without a career, that children are boring, they're not challenging enough.
Right.
I think, to be honest, I go to work and it's like my break, but that's all that matter. And so that being said, who stands to gain? Well, the biggest slave master there is, the government, because they want more taxpayers. They want a bigger economy and they could get more money. And now you're paying childcare workers. So guess what? You got more wage earners paying taxes. And so that's what this is all about in the end of the day. It's not really due to practical necessity. And
you have to ask yourself, is it really a good idea for your children to be raised by people who are not related to them and don't really care for them like their own flesh and blood would? And there are some cases where a woman might have no choice but to do that. And so obviously, if they have no choice, they have no choice. But if you do have a choice, why would you put your children in that situation? When my daughter leaves my granddaughter with me, she knows I'm going to take care of my granddaughter because, that's my granddaughter. I would do anything to save my granddaughter, to protect her, whatever it took. A babysitter who's just getting paid minimum wage is not necessarily going to have that same kind of concern. And so there's all kinds of bad things that can happen when you just are paying people.
And it's also the wrong example. And oftentimes the example is more important. That's the only thing that lasts. That's your legacy, ultimately, is your kids.
Right.
And they learn by what they see. Someone quoted St. Pius above. If I could quickly grab it, it's ultra relevant to what we're saying, but I'm also not this computer expert. But someone quoted St. Pius and said, oh, this is great. Where is it? Oh, well, I might not be able to find it quick enough, Father. And I'm not going to ruin this show looking for it, but hopefully maybe he will. Here we go. The best inheritance parents can bestow upon their children is their own spiritual devotion. And so versus you have an unbeliever bringing up your kids, you have someone who doesn't care about them, that doesn't see you trying to please God, then that is going to be the legacy you leave behind.
And you wind up with children who are not really attached to you. And they're probably not really attached to the people at daycare either, because the daycare people change out. So they wind up being rootless. And that's not good. You want your children to be attached to their family and to get the enrichment that they get from their family, but also to care about their family. You want those kinds of bonds, because that's what makes for good people. That's what makes for a good society.
Now, let me ask a question which is maybe less controversial for you than for many, because you are a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, and they've maintained the traditional teaching generally on the issue of women wearing head coverings. And so my question to you is, what's with this practice having fallen radically into disuse in many corners of Orthodoxy? How do you feel about that, and why do you think it's important?
Well, I've written a couple of articles on the subject, so you can look them up if you want more detail. But one thing I would point out is that the idea in Christian society is that women were supposed to cover their heads in church is not something that's unique to the Orthodox Church. If you go back and you watch movies made prior to the 60s, and you see scenes where people are in church, you will see women with their heads covered. And that was true of Protestant churches, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches. I remember, even though I was born in 1966, and so obviously I don't remember the 50s at all, and only have the vaguest recollections of the 60s, but even in the 70s, when I do have some fairly strong memories, I remember seeing a lot of women with their heads covered in a Protestant evangelical church. It wasn't 100%, but a lot of them were still doing it. If you go to your typical Black Baptist church or Pentecostal church, you're going to see a lot of women with their heads covered. And Black people, when it comes to religion, tend to be the most traditionally minded Americans on average, and that's just a fact. And so if you want to see how traditional religion it has been in America, you can still see it in action in most Black churches. And there is this whole thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 where St. Paul says that women are supposed to do it. And they say that it's because of the angel.
Little thing.
And so it's obviously not just a matter of culture. Like your typical Protestant tries to explain this away and say, well, in Corinth, only whores went around with their heads uncovered, and so it was unseemly for Christian women to not cover their heads. But that's not true in our culture, so therefore it doesn't matter. Well, it's just not true. You know, this was this is like a folk interpretation, but there's not any real historical evidence that backs this up.
That's the annoying part. It's just made up.
Right. It's pulled out of thin air. Someone speculated one day and thought, well, maybe that's the reason. And that once it got spoken, it's been repeated ad infinitum since then. But it's just, there's no basis for it. And Christian women have always done it. And so therefore, there's no reason why it ought to stop. And why is it that women should do it? Well, I mean, there are probably a lot of reasons that we could talk about. St. Paul talks about it as being a sign of authority, that the woman's under the authority of her husband. But also, there's the question of modesty and men's propensity to be distracted. If you bring up the subject of women's ordination, a while back, I remember seeing she was actually a fairly conservative evangelical type, but she was an Anglican in England, but she was a woman priest, a priestess, really, to be precise. And this was a pretty good looking woman. And the reality of it is, you can deny it all you want, but the natural inclination of a man in a situation like that is going to be focusing on this beautiful woman who's speaking, not necessarily the importance of the words that she's speaking. There's a reason why we don't have women in these positions, and there's a reason why we have men in those positions. Women are different. Women don't relate to men the same way men relate to women. You don't have the same weaknesses that men have, and men, they don't have the same weaknesses that women have. So by women covering their heads, this, for one thing, you don't have to worry about women focusing on hairstyles as much in the services, because women are just covering their heads. It all adds to helping us focus on worshiping God rather than being distracted by other things. And if you look at the icons of the saints, with very few exceptions, St. Mary of Egypt being the one that comes to mind, what are the women doing in those icons? Their heads are covered. This. If you want to be like the saints, take a look at the icons and be like the saints.
No, that's good points, Father. And this may scandalize people, but in the old country, so I even don't really see this in Rocourt churches in the United States, unless you're the monastery. But men and women would stand in separate parts of church for that reason. Right. And unlike the Muslims, where the men in front of the woman, it's equal. They're just in different sides, and it's to prevent distraction, because the idea is to be completely focused in worship. For Pete's sake, the Eucharist is God's physical presence. So you ought to be paying attention.
Right.
And so and that has all sorts of interesting ramifications with children, obviously. But it's so people forget there's a sort of ultra propriety that we want due to the reality of what the liturgy is. And as you pointed out, St. Paul's rationale for head covering has to do with the angelic realm. And then he argues, doesn't nature also teach you that long hair is given to women as a covering, which is not meaning long hair is some replacement for a physical covering, but that even nature shows you that women have long hair. So that shows you that this practice of covering hair is something that even nature allows us to perceive as necessary, because long hair is the glory of women.
Also, one thing I've pointed out occasionally when I've talked about this to people in my own parish is that there's no one in the parish who is more encumbered by traditional obligations in terms of attire than the clergy. Because if you're following traditional practice rather than some of the modernist practices that we have in some quarters, clergy are supposed to be wearing a cassock whenever they're out in public. So I'm always having to dress traditionally, and it's a lot more of a hassle than it would be putting on a headscarf. Another thing I would point out is, if you live in an area where it gets cold, I remember when I was a new convert, I was up in Jordanville, where it was, the high was 50 below, practically, very often. When I remember having a hat on, one of these beanie type things to keep my head from freezing, and walking into the church without thinking about it, and someone in me saying, "Oh, no, you take that off." Well, in that kind of a climate, having a head covering that you don't have to take off has certain advantages. Men are not allowed to wear a head covering in church. Clergy are an exception, but even clergy have to uncover their heads at certain parts of the church, whereas women do not. And historically, prior to very modern times, everybody wore hats almost everywhere they went. And so wearing hats was not seen as a burden. It was just natural. Everybody wore them all the time. It was men that had to take them off when they came inside, and particularly when they were in church. Women did not.
Yeah, people aren't aware that the hats, jackets, why do it look like everyone's dressed to nines all the time? Back then, there wasn't climate control everywhere. So your climate control was your ability to add and shed layers. And so it was like that for most of history. And so that's something for people to keep in mind, that a man not covering his head, and believe me, I've been to Jordanville and lots of cold churches in central New York, and you wish you could keep your head covered. I particularly get cold.
And among clergy, head coverings that you're able to wear in church are actually an award. And if you're at the highest level, you're a bishop and you wear a mitre. But even the bishop has to take off his head covering, but women do not. So on some level, you could say women have the highest award.
There you go. The mitre that never goes off. So let me give a few quotations with the intent of shocking the audience from the fathers and getting your response. That sounds fun, brother?
All right, sure.
I'm going to read, we talked about this little off air, something that St. Ambrose writes about modesty in dress. And so we know that 1 Peter 3 talks about women shouldn't adorn themselves. And most translations will put the word merely in italics. Well, obviously women wear clothes. They just shouldn't merely adorn themselves. But the literal Greek is they shouldn't adorn themselves. Right. How St. Ambrose kind of applied that teaching, because we see in the episode, because again, this book is on Abraham, which you can't see because of the colorization of the camera, that we know that when Abraham's servant was at the well and saw Rebecca, he gave her earrings and bracelets. Like, so women say, aha, look, that means we could wear jewelry to church. How does St. Ambrose respond? He said, perhaps when you hear this, that whole episode, the bracelets and earrings, O daughters who seek the Lord's favor, ye will challenge us, that ye may have earrings and bracelets, and say, how, O bishop, do ye forbid us to have what Rebekah received as gift, yet exhort us to be like Rebekah? But Rebekah did not have the earrings and bracelets which are wont to sow strife in the church, and which frequently decay, She had other earrings, other bracelets, which I would that ye had. Rebecca's earrings are symbols of pious listening, and Rebecca's bracelets are the adornments of deeds. She had the earrings, which would not weigh down her ears, but stroke them carelessly. The bracelets, which would not overload her wrist with material gold, but exalt them with spiritual action. So let me ask you this, Father. That sounds to me that he's saying women shouldn't wear jewelry to church.
Right. Well, I would say at the very least they shouldn't be wearing anything that's gaudy, as a general rule, in terms of how men and women both should be dressed in church, whatever they're wearing should not be distracting. And so, for example, I know particularly in the Russian church, you often hear people make a big issue about women wearing dresses. And I've seen some cases where a woman would come in with a split skirt and be told that she needed to wear a wraparound skirt because the split skirt was too much like pants. But then a woman would come in a mini skirt and no one would say anything. And bizarre. I would say that given the choice between a mini skirt and a split skirt, I would pick with the split skirt 100% of the time. Modesty is the goal. And so I wouldn't say that women couldn't wear jewelry at all. Although I think St. Ambrose, judging from the quote, probably would say that, but it ought to be pretty modest stuff. And particularly if you got your head covered, if you have an earring, no one's going to be able to see it. It ought to be very modest and certainly not something that's distracting. You don't want to put on airs and be ostentatious with your apparel, particularly in the services.
Well, certainly that's a step in the right direction. We should be going to church humility. It's not a fashion show. We're not trying to show up the other women. These days, men are becoming so effeminate. They're trying to show up other men, which is what we ought not to be doing. We should have humility. And the early church was extremely austere, and they took that to as austere of a direction as they possibly can.
And I would certainly say that a woman who did that out of piety certainly wouldn't be doing anything wrong.
Not wearing jewelry, yes.
Right.
And just for those who are like St. John Maximovich didn't want women wearing lipstick because he didn't want the women venerating the icons or the chalice, and their lipstick would get on it. So this even kind of goes into the saints in other directions as well.
Right.
Here's another pretty extreme one. This is from St. Jerome in his commentary on Titus. He says, women, he actually says they, but he means women, are also to bear themselves in a way proper for their sex, to maintain a holy manner in bodily movements, facial expressions, words, silence, and whatever tends to the dignity of a holy decorum.
Right.
And so I read that, and it sounds to me what St. Jerome is saying. We kind of don't want women cursing like sailors and acting gruff. We want a certain femininity. That this is what we'd be shooting for. Is this saint teaching something toxic in your view? And how would we apply this today?
I would certainly not toxic. If you read literature from, say, the 19th century and then back, further into the past, you can't help but get the impression that not only did women think of themselves as being morally superior to men, but men thought that women were morally superior to men. And you didn't have women prisons being built because women didn't need prisons. Men needed prisons. Women didn't need prisons. Now, because of feminism, where we've tried to encourage little girls to be just like a man and swear like a man, be as obnoxious as a man, engage in all the most negative things that a man could do. Now we need women prisons. Is that one, small step for women, one giant step for womankind? I don't think so. I think that's a step backwards. So,
and to connect to what you were saying earlier about the innate difference in men and women, my brother works in a women's prison. And it's completely different than a men's prison when it comes down to there's not the level of he's in maximum security, by the way. It's not it's not the level of physical violence. The violence is generally self-inflicted, sadly. And just the way men and women are in prison is very different because men and women are very different. And
Right.
if these are the people that break the law, they're purposely not trying to follow the rules. This could have no other reason than other than the fact that the genders are very different.
Right. Yeah, I don't think we've had very many women serial killers, for example, but I'm not mentioning that to set out a challenge so that women will strive to see if they can surpass, Ted Bundy or something like that. These are all negative things about these are the worst behaviors of men that ought to not be emulated by women. Women ought to embrace being women and try to live up to the ideals of womanhood rather than try to see being a man as superior and then trying to follow that road.
Now, and like you were alluding to before, women want the high-powered business jobs. Generally, people don't want to be the person sucking out septic tanks, right? Like those aren't the glamorous jobs that people want equality in. And so it's something that people want assertive things because they want to get something or whatever. But generally, a lot of these things are actually negative that people want, and we should want what's positive. Right. And I think if we keep that in the back of our minds, this final quote, because I won't keep hammering you with these, sort of is like, well, what is the spiritual discipline that St. John Chrysostom's talking about? So here's St. John Chrysostom commenting on 1 Timothy chapter 2. He says the following. Great modesty and great propriety does the blessed Paul require of women, and that not only with respect to their dress and appearance. He proceeds even to regulate their speech. And what says he? Let the woman learn in silence. That is, let her not speak at all in the church, which rule he has also given in his epistle to the Corinthians, where he says, it is a shame for a woman to speak in the church. And the reason is that the law has made them subject to men. And again, elsewhere. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. To such a degree should women be silent that they are not allowed to speak not only about worldly matters, but not even about spiritual things in the church. This is order. This is modesty. This will adorn her more than any garments. Thus clothed, she will be able to offer her prayers in the manner most becoming. Now, Father, this sounds pretty darn extreme. Could you try to help us with this one?
Well, there's also places where St. Paul talks about men being silent in church too. And one thing you just have to think about is there is an order that's supposed to be maintained in church. And really the only people who should be talking in the services are the clergy who have things to say liturgically. Now, one thing I would say, I have heard people who would take this so far as to say that we should have all male choirs and that women shouldn't even sing in church. And that I don't think you can defend historically because, for example, in Constantinople, you had the deaconesses, as I mentioned, they actually had a choir of deaconesses, and you had the same thing in the Holy Sepulchre. This was true even in ancient times. And when you church an infant in the Orthodox Church, if it's a girl, you say, in the midst of the church shall she sing thy praises. And I don't think we would say liturgically that a child is going to sing God's praises in the midst of the church if we didn't intend for them to actually do it. So I would say that is sort of a balance there. But we should all respect the order. And I think that what St. Paul was primarily focused on there was women chit-chatting in the services. And it's not just women that do this, of course. Men do it too. And it's something that we should all be aware of. Particularly at the end of the services when the post-communion prayers are being read, I unfortunately have to remind people with some frequency that they should be quiet. And I know they're anxious to talk to people that they haven't seen all week, but they should take it outside. And if they took communion, they should be quietly listening to the post-communion prayers.
Yes, essentially all we're seeing here is a gender-specific application for meekness. Right. Just like Jesus says that when a man looks upon a woman with lust, commit adultery in hearts. That doesn't mean a woman's incapable of that, obviously, but this is obviously more of a pitfall for men than for women. Right. And so the sort of, like you said, whether it's chit-chat, asking the husband, in the middle of the service, what did Father just say? I don't, this is something that St. Paul is warning against. And so meekness is the issue. Silence is something that is not what I'm blessed with, but it is a spiritual gift. And so we see St. John Chrysostom reiterating what St. Paul said in extolling people towards this sort of meekness. And the services, like we're talking before, the liturgy, if you understand what the liturgy really is that serious. We ought to be quiet and at attention.
Matter of fact, in the cathedral in Chicago, the Roquefort Cathedral, it's actually in Des Plaines, Illinois, but they have signs in Russian all over the cathedral that say the same thing. And I wish they should really put it in English too, for the sake of the people who don't read Russian. But of course, most people who go there do read Russian. But it's a quote from St. Ambrose of Opton, and it says, "God sends great sorrows on those who talk during the liturgy." and so it's a very somber reminder that we should be quiet during the services.
Now, let me ask you one last question, because you spent more than enough time with us this evening and away from your granddaughter. I think I hear some rumbling in the background. Let's beat up on men a little bit. Where do men fall short, right? We're talking about gender roles. There's both men and women. What ought men to be doing that you're noticing in the church, not just the total losers that are not taking care of their kids and stuff like that? Where are men falling short? How should they be applying the teachings of the scriptures and the saints?
Well, you have unfortunately too many men that don't step up to the plate and take leadership roles in the church or at home. They're just very passive, and in some cases, I think that's because the women are not encouraging them to take those roles. But in other cases, it's just because we've kind of created a generation of men that have been feminized and are afraid to act in a way that their fathers and grandfathers would have acted. And this has a lot of negative results. I mean, women really desire, even though they might not always know it, but they really desire a man to take that kind of leadership in the home. And I often hear women complaining about that in confessions and in other conversations, that their husbands are not more involved and more engaged. So they really desire that. But that requires the woman or the wife to encourage it. It also requires the husband to step up to the plate and actually do it. So there's two things that have to happen for that. And of course, there always have been men who failed to live up to their responsibilities as providers and protectors of their family. So you have men who abandon their families, and obviously that's a shameful thing. But in our society, you also have women who push men out of those roles, and then they wind up ruining, the results of it. And I'm speaking as someone who worked in child support for about 17 years, I think, something like that. And so I saw these results firsthand. And I listened to women every day complaining about men not doing what they were supposed to be doing. But I also listened to some men complain about the fact that they were being prevented from doing what they needed to do with their children. And so we need both men and women to work together, raising children and encouraging men to actually fulfill their role. Women, in our society, continue to fulfill their role as mothers for the most part. Obviously, if they're letting daycare raise their children, they're not doing the ideal thing for their children if it's something they have a choice about. But it's the men who all too often now are not as involved in the raising their children as they should be, and that's what needs to change if we want to have a strong society, if we want our children to grow up in a healthy way.
All right, so they should be involved, but not to point daddy daycare where they're allowing women to abdicate their responsibilities.
Right, and you also don't want to have men who are just whipping out the Bible and saying it says you're supposed to submit, so therefore you need to submit. That's not leadership. That's not how that's supposed to work.
Now, Father, you know what I find hard about leadership? My wife, right, she wants a leader. So she'd be like, I could ask, what do you want for dinner, honey? Because I want to love and honor my wife. Oh, I don't know, whatever you want. Oh, how about we get Chinese? Oh, I don't want that. Oh, how about pizza? I'm not in the mood for pizza. So, right? So you're leading, but in reality, they're going to get their way eventually. It's just how they go about it. I'm more telling a joke than anything. So anyway, we got a couple questions from the audience. Do you have some time to take some audience questions?
Sure. But let me tell you a story real quick about leadership.
Sure.
My youngest daughter became a very successful salesman for a while when she was working in retail.
Saleswoman.
And she speaks Chinese, mainly Cantonese, but she understands Mandarin. She also learned Korean and Japanese. And one of the things that she told me she would do is she would have Asian women who would come into the store and they would start talking about, you know, what dress they wanted to buy, for example. And she could tell by what they were saying that they were leaning in a particular direction. So what she would do is just come and confirm where they were already leaning, and then they would buy it. So sometimes what leadership is figuring out where your spouse is wanting to go, and then encouraging them to go in that direction, as long as it's in a healthy direction.
Well, and that's what all good coaching and teaching and everything is, really.
Right.
Is letting people utilize their God-given talents and their capabilities, or what dresses they want, whatever. So we got this question. We sort of talked about it, which is, could you speak on modest dress code during church? How to approach it when you see not only women with very revealing short dresses, or even men with shorts and short-sleeved shirts. I have to say, Father, going to Orthodoxy, I prepare my family, if they ever go to a service, we're not as formal as like what they're used to in other churches. We're very informal sometimes, to the point of absurdly informal. Like you're hearing guys wearing shorts or women with short skirts, like stuff that you think would be inappropriate for church. So how about some pointers about what is modest without being, I don't know, I would say maybe holier than thou?
Well, men should not be wearing shorts in church, but if you're talking about outside of the context of the services, they should certainly not be wearing something that's revealing. And I think it's less of a problem for men than it is for women, just because men have less to reveal, and also women don't tend to react the same way to it as men do to women. But you might have a man who is bodybuilder or what have you, and he's trying to strut his stuff. That obviously is not the way a Christian would behave. You're not trying to draw that kind of attention to yourself if you're a Christian. And so women should be the same way. There's no reason why an Orthodox woman should be running around dressed in a revealing way in public. It's just never going to be a good thing.
So, Father, you can say next question. This one, he said, "You getting the COVID vax?"
Heck to the no. Nope.
So this comment I just found interesting because I seen it in Cambodia, my wife's country. A guy said, "I had the 50s life in Brazil for a couple of years. We had a maid and 2 nannies. Help is way too expensive in the U.S. We can never afford it. I miss having clothes dried on the line." And in America, like anyone who lives in an old house, there's servants' quarters in all the old houses, because just that was like that here too. There's always been help, because in a sense, where there's no social safety net, how do you get someone to feed you and house you? Oh, I'll take care of you, and you make sure I can live somewhere in your house. It was actually quite good. And someone would pay people to do nothing. We lose help that is necessary for family. So when we read the scriptures and we see Titus chapter 2, we presume it's like the woman alone at home. That's not how most families, even people with modest existences, had servants, because you had a house, you had something that someone needed, so they wouldn't be homeless. And so it's an interesting comment. I see in Cambodia, you see people way poorer than us having way more help than we do. And I live in central New York, where there's tons of old houses. They all have servants' quarters, and it's just something that's common. I don't know, is Texas like that at all, Father?
Well, I've not spent a lot of time around old houses in Texas, so I've not seen that. But I'm quite sure that if you were looking at houses that go back far enough, you would see that. And if you were able to afford servants back then, or if you're able to afford servants now, I mean, I suppose it's not a bad thing to have them, because you're providing someone with a living that obviously wants to do it. But I think the more practical thing for most of us who are not, daddy warbucks, we need to stay close to family, because there's lots of people in your family that would be more than happy to help you out taking care of your kids. But if you're not near them, they're not going to be able to do it.
Now, this is sort of related to that note, because we have families that have, due to Social Security and lack of appreciation for mutual obligations, where we don't have that. We have here the stereotype: their grandparents are too busy with their dogs and cats and their active lifestyle to help out. Grandparents aren't the same as when we were growing up. So obviously this is not true of you, Father, because we're just talking about your granddaughter. But how about what you see going around? Is this something that's sadly becoming, like you said, these reliable family members, less and less common?
Well, it's one of these kinds of things where your mileage is obviously going to vary. But one thing I can tell you from having worked in welfare and child support is particularly among the poor people, where illegitimacy has become a much bigger thing, seeing grandparents that stepped up to the plate and had played a major role in the raising their children, or took over the role of raising their children, is something I saw all the time. But it often occurred to me that what's going to happen when that generation of grandparents is gone, and the irresponsible parents that are needing those grandparents to raise their own children or grandparents, one can hope that maybe they'll be wiser and step up to the plate. But I think it's probably going to become more of a problem. I mean, obviously, people who are selfish with their own, when they're raising their own children, are not going to be very inclined to do it with their grandparents. But it's frankly hard for me to understand why any grandparent wouldn't want to spend time with their grandkids. I mean, grandkids are great. I was comparing notes with another grandfather last year when I was still fairly new to the job myself, and what he told me was, he was talking to his kids, and he said, your mother and I thought that we loved you, but it turns out that we just liked you a lot. Because we really love our grandkids. And he's obviously being facetious. We of course, parents love their children, but the love a grandparent has for their grandchildren, it's just on a different level. And the joy is on a different level, and I can't really explain it completely. I enjoyed having my own kids. I spent time with them when they were little, and enjoyed that. But grandkids, I highly recommend it.
So don't become a dog grandma. Become a
right.
real grandma.
I mean, this idea of replacing pets for children is just something that's a sickness in society. You have all these, like you see cars where they say, I'm a mother of a dog or a cat or something. I can't remember exactly how these things are phrased, but basically that's what they're trying to say is, my cat is my kid. That's sick. That is really sick. You should have kids. And if you don't have kids, maybe you need to find some children that don't have parents that are able to take care of them and adopt them. And I don't mean necessarily legally adopt them, but try to apply your paternal or maternal instincts to actual human beings, and try to invest that in people who can actually come to know Christ and be saved, if you actually provided them with the right direction in life, rather than to a dog or a cat who, they're sinless beings and they don't need your help.
It's disgusting, even the money people spend on it. Like they have doggy daycare because the dogs need intellectual stimulation, like weird stuff, like stuff I thought I'd never see. Like, it's an animal. It's just happy if you feed it, and when you're gone.
I've known people who've had hip replacement surgeries for their dogs. And I'm sorry, I've never had. I've always liked dogs, and I, can tolerate cats, but as much as I have liked dogs in my life, if a dog ever got to the point where they needed a hip replacement, it would be time to put them down. Spending that kind of money on a dog when there are people who need hip replacement surgeries and they don't get them because they don't have the money, that's a travesty.
It's like I said, it's a sickness, and I think that it comes from people's selfishness. They become self-absorbed. They don't realize it's more blessed they give than receive, as the scriptures say, and they feel more fulfilled giving themselves their families. Like a husband feels more fulfilled giving himself for his wife, and a wife giving herself to her husband, that we should serve as Christ served. Someone has a question: is it incumbent upon a man his role of authority figure, I suppose, to also have a driver's license? Is that a prerequisite for being perceived as a figure of authority by a woman? And my guess would be it depends on whether you live in middle Manhattan and you can take mass transportation, and that's common. Or, I mean, obviously you need the work. Isn't that really what it comes down to? You need to work and bring food home and all that sort of stuff.
To be a man is to be a provider, and that's a basic thing that, even before the fall, God had work to do for both the man and the woman, but the man especially had a responsibility to labor, and that certainly continues to be true after the fall, but all the more so.
Now, we had a question here, and I think this is an important one because I've thought about this. Kind of off subject, but should we attempt to bring back having the catechumens actually depart? And I think that's relevant because it's almost become that, like we had people tattletaling on their priest during the COVID stuff, if they weren't found this or that extraneous rule. And it would seem to me if more people weren't communed for not confessing regularly, and you would kind of know if they're gonna be rats or not, or you've never seen them before, so you'd have no reason to keep them there. And even if you're visiting out of town, you always introduce yourself to the priest beforehand. You let him know in vigil, I'm going to church tomorrow. It shouldn't be like you just show up and think he's going to commune you. Should we make these people depart?
Well, I think that, I could imagine a scenario where we might actually get back to that early church discipline, but it wouldn't just be because, hey, why are we leaving these catechumens in there? Because you have to think about the fact you have people who visit your parish, and you don't interrogate them to see, hey, are you Orthodox? Because we're going to kick you out of the church after the dismissal of catechumens. And actually, if we're going by old church discipline, they wouldn't be even allowed in the church doors because you had to at least be a catechumen to even enter the narthex. But with these kinds of lockdowns, I could imagine a scenario where people start going back to having services that they only admit people that they know, and the locations are undisclosed. And in that kind of a situation, you might start doing that. Now, one other way you could do it, I know Father Josiah Trenham's parish does this, and they have such a well-developed catechetical program that if you're a catechumen, after the dismissal of the catechumens, you depart and you go into a classroom, and there's a team of, I think it was 8 laity that rotate over an 8-week period teaching the catechumens, and they're all specializing in different topics. And so that's what's done for the rest of the liturgy for the catechumens. And obviously, if it's your week, you aren't able to take communion that week. So if you're able to pull that off, I think that's a great thing. Most parishes, I would say, are probably not up to that kind of level of sophistication. But if you could get there, I would say that would be great. One thing, Father Josiah came to our diocese. We had a diocesan conference, and he made a presentation on the subject. And one of the things I've been kicking myself since then is I should have asked him, this is wonderful what you're doing, but how did you get from not having that to what you've got now? That's the question that I would like to find out.
Jump over that hurdle.
Right. So anyway, that's my long answer to the short question.
Well, we'll just guys, this is the internet. Just bother him until he gives the answer publicly. We can figure that out. So, Father, I'm really appreciative of having you on tonight to talk about this topic. It's ultra important. Where can people learn more about this and what you're up to? I obviously have your website scrolling down there, but how about you tell people about it?
Well, there's a lot of stuff you'll find on our parish website, stjonah.org. There's a lot of articles, and what I put on the articles page tends to be the more highly polished articles. Then I have my blog, and there's stuff that I post on there fairly regularly. Now, since the COVID stuff's been going on, I've been posting a lot of reader service material, which is also available on stjonah.org, but more specific to the month material with idiot-proof versions. Everything put together is available on the blog. And so if you're in a situation where you're not able to go to church, even if there is no lockdown, but you just aren't able to go to church on a particular Sunday or feast day, you'll find the material there to actually at least do Typica and do it without having to know how to put it together, because it's all there. So that's basically it. Now, last time I was on, I mentioned that I was trying to get to the point where I was making videos about how to do reader services, and I've still got that in the back of my mind. And I think probably starting in the fall, I'll have a little bit more time to do that. But that's still something I'm trying to get to where I can produce it.
So we're looking forward to your future channel when it does come out. And in the meantime, if we want to get our Father John fix, we go to stjonah.org, and we got your blog spot there, fatherjohn.blogspot.com. And my plug is for orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. If you guys want to help evangelize in Cambodia, we got 2.5, I like to say, parishes there, because they go in and out of Siem Reap. They're not there on a permanent basis. We're translating liturgical works and Lives of the Saints. So please donate to that. But it doesn't have to just be that. Donate to your local monastery. Give alms. If this has blessed you, please bless someone else. So before we run, Father, do you have any last words, any final pearls of wisdom that the audience should take in mind concerning gender roles?
Well, just that men and women are different, and we should embrace what we are. God created us as we are, and we should seek to find out what our role is. What has God got for us? And not complain about what our role is not. There's a lot of things that I might have liked to wish to have been able to do in life, but what God has given me the ability to do, that I'm trying to do, and that's what everybody should be doing. And God's created a wonderful potentiality between men and women, and if you embrace it, you can have wonderful relationships. You can have children and grandchildren. It's all great. That's the positive things that we should all be striving to make happen, and it can happen if we embrace our faith, and if we're both submitting to the Lord, then it's a little easier for us to submit to one another.
Well, Father, thank you for those words, and I will end the show not only concurring with you. Children are awesome, and marriage is awesome, despite the difficulties that both pose. And I will end the show with this quote from Jesus Sirach, which is, "Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you." God bless you all, guys. Have a good day.